Mr. President, today we will begin the most important debate this Congress will have this year, probably this Congress, perhaps in the entire tenure that any member of this Senate has. That's a debate not just about this piece of legislation, but a debate about a nuclear Iran and the consequences that a nuclear Iran would create for the world. It is today the gravest threat to the world. Iran already is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, according to the Obama administration's own State Department. We see their regional aggression on display in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, now in Yemen. They have a very bad habit of killing Jews around the world, from Israel to Bulgaria to Argentina. They hold 4 U.S. citizens hostage today without just cause or due process. They do all those things without a nuclear weapon and with tens of billions of dollars frozen overseas. What could we expect if Iran is able to develop nuclear weapons capabilities? First, we'll see more regional aggression as they use their nuclear umbrella to continue their drive for regional dominance throughout the Middle East. And as they use the tens of billions of dollars sanctions relief would give them, not to build hospitals or schools or roads or to improve the lives of their people, but rather to prop up their proxies like Hezbollah or the Houthis or Shiite militias that are currently at risk of tearing Iraq apart. Second, they are likely to use those nuclear weapons. Ayatollah Khomeini, the original supreme leader, upon taking power, said that the Islamic Revolution did not care about Iran or the Persian nation or its history. They cared about spreading worldwide Islamic revolution. This is not a normal state, and these are not normal leaders. Third, we'll see a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East. As many senators in this institution have heard from senior government officials of Sunni states throughout the Gulf, they cannot tolerate a Persian Shiite nuclear power, whether they develop with their indigenous capabilities in some instances or whether they purchase it from overseas. We'll see the world's most dangerous and volatile region strung with nuclear tripwires. Fourth, these countries may provide nuclear weapons to terrorists to be used against American troops in the region, against our allies like Israel or other countries, or in one of the harbors on America's coasts, if not in the American heartland. Or fifth, terrorists or insurgents could get their hands on nuclear materials if they were able to destabilize or topple the wrong regime, as has tended to happen in the Middle East in the last 4 years and in recent decades. The president started these negotiations on the grounds that we would stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Yet he has consistently backpedaled, conceded, and reversed himself. Rather than now trying to dismantle and disarm Iran's nuclear program, we are content to try to manage it, to limit its breakout time to 1 mere year, if that. The United Nations Security Council has passed multiple resolutions saying that Iran has no right to enrich uranium. Yet now we're going to concede Iran the right to keep thousands of centrifuges, to continue advanced research into centrifuges, to keep its stockpiles of uranium. The president said less than a year ago, or I should say barely more than a year ago, after the negotiations started, that Iran had no reason to have a hardened underground military bunker in which they kept centrifuge cascades in Fordo. Yet, according to our own proposed fact sheet, much of which Iran disputes, we're going to concede that Fordo will remain open. The president said at the very same time, after negotiations begun, that Iran had no reason to keep its uranium stockpiles, and Iran had in fact reportedly agreed to tentatively export those to a third party. The last minute in Switzerland earlier this month, they reversed themselves, saying they were going to insist on keeping their stockpiles. We conceded on that front as well. We have insisted throughout the period of these negotiations that we would not grant Iran immediate sanctions relief. The president's own term sheet said we wouldn't grant such relief. Iran's term sheet says differently. And just Friday, when confronted with this discrepancy, the president said we may have to find creative ways around this disagreement. Creative ways to give Iran, the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, on its way to becoming a nuclear threshold power, tens of billions of dollars. Reportedly, even a $50 billion signing bonus, as if Iran was not a theocratic dictatorial regime, but a blue-chip prospect in the NFL draft. These negotiations have also excluded most of Iran's outlaw behavior, currently developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, for which there's no reason other than to strike the United States, holding those 4 hostages without due process or fair trials, stopping its regional aggression, stopping its support for terrorism. This legislation has some good elements in it. It would suspend the President's ability to waive any sanctions for approximately 7 weeks while we consider any proposed deal if such a deal is reached at some point in the future. It would also require the President to certify every 90 days that Iran is living up to its obligations under any such deal. But it only goes into effect after such a deal is announced. And any deal along the lines that the President proposed 2 weeks ago is dangerous for the United States and dangerous for the world. And it's Congress's job to stop such a deal before it happens. Now, the sponsors of this bill didn't upend the constitutional baseline. This bill should be submitted for a treaty. The President should have to get 67 votes for a major nuclear arms agreement with an outlaw regime. But instead, Congress has to get 67 votes in the Senate to block such a bill. That's why I intend to support Senator Johnson's amendment that would require this to be submitted as a treaty. This legislation omits most of Iran's outlaw behavior, and it doesn't lay out the terms on which Congress would insist before there is sanctions relief in addressing this outlaw behavior. And it may allow the President to argue in the future if a mere 34 senators vote against a resolution of disapproval, to say that Congress has acquiesced in his agreement and that he now has support from the Congress, not just acting on his own whim. Therefore, I expect to support amendments that are offered in 3 main categories. First, an amendment that would treat any resolution of disapproval as a privileged amendment, subject not to a 60-vote threshold, but to a 51-vote threshold. We should not let 34 senators block a resolution of disapproval from going into effect. We certainly shouldn't allow 41 senators to impede the will of 59 senators who disagree with any future deal from forcing the President to veto it and depriving him of the ability to claim that Congress has acquiesced to his action. The second main category would be to limit the administration's discretion in the future on reporting about breaches of an agreement should an agreement be reached and should it not be blocked by the Congress. This legislation says that the Congress or that the administration should report potentially significant breaches to the Congress and then determine whether those potentially significant breaches are a material breach, which it defines as substantially reducing Iran's breakout time or improving Iran's nuclear program. We should strike those lawyers' vague terms. They should submit every breach to us. They should submit every time the breakout time is decreased so Iran's nuclear program improves its position. It is our job as the people's representatives to decide whether that is material, whether it's significant. And the third category of amendments is that Iran should not get sanctions relief until they live up to their international obligations, until they meet the very baseline terms that the President himself laid out at the beginning of these negotiations, or even after the negotiations had begun, and until Iran acts like a civilized country. There should be no sanctions relief until the President can certify that the hardened underground military facility at Fordo is closed. He himself said Iran had no need for it. There should be no sanctions relief until Iran has lived up to its international obligations to the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, and disclosed the past military dimensions of its nuclear program, without which inspectors have no baseline to know what the status of their program is today. There should be no sanctions relief until the President can certify that Iran is not developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have missiles that can defend their own territory and that can strike most of their neighbors in the Middle East. They are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles for one reason: to strike the United States with a nuclear warhead. There should be no sanctions relief until the president can certify that Iran is not any longer sponsoring terrorism, because it goes to the heart of the threat that Iran poses. Other countries in the world are a nuclear threshold power: Japan and Germany and South Korea. We don't have debates about those countries being a nuclear threshold power because they are normal countries with normal leaders who do not call us the great Satan and call Israel the little Satan and threaten to wipe Israel off the map. Until the nature of the Iran regime changes, we cannot allow them to have weapons of this nature, and they will not change until they renounce terrorism. Next, the president should have to certify that Iran is not cooperating with North Korea, as it has done countless times on ballistic missile programs and nuclear technology, an outlaw regime whose current nuclear status foretells the future of this deal. In 1994, the agreed framework was supposed to stop North Korea from becoming a nuclear power. Yet just 12 years later, they developed nuclear weapons. Now, by most estimates, they have 20, a number that could double in just a few years, most of which, or most of the United States falling underneath the threat of a North Korean nuclear attack. Next, there should be no sanctions relief until all 4 American hostages are released: Pastor Syed Ahmadini, Amir Hekmati, a decorated Marine, Robert Levinson, and Jason Rezaian, a Washington Post reporter. That should have been a term before we even sat down at the table, that no American citizen will be held hostage by an outlaw, third-rate regime like Iran before we start negotiating with them. They and their families deserve no less. There should be no sanctions relief until the president can certify that Iran has agreed to anytime, anywhere inspections. This is an ongoing point of major dispute between President Obama and Iran's leaders. But if we can't go to their military facilities, if we can't inspect any facility instantly, without notification, we'll be engaged in the same kind of cat and mouse regime that has caused inspections regimes to fail time and time again. Finally, Iran should recognize Israel's right to exist. It's not too much to simply say that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish and a democratic country from a country that just a few months ago was tweeting 9 different reasons why Israel should be annihilated from the world. These are very simple terms, most of which President Obama himself outlined before these negotiations began, or which are clear and binding international obligations on Iran. There are good amendments that would strengthen this bill, a bill that touches on the most important issues that most of us will address during our time in the United States Senate. When we considered the Keystone Pipeline bill, an important bill, but a bill that dealt with a single pipeline, we considered almost 250 amendments. We voted on over 40. Surely we should have the same kind of robust consideration, debate, and voting on this bill. And I strongly support the majority leader's call earlier this morning for exactly that kind of robust process. Most of these amendments touch directly on the heart of this legislation. I look forward to casting up or down votes at a 51-vote threshold on all of these amendments and many more that my colleagues may offer. I regret that I may miss some of this debate. I may have to ask some of my colleagues to submit amendments for me. My first child is due today. By the time this bill gets to the floor next week for debating and voting, I expect my first child will have arrived. But I will not allow my son to live under the threat of a nuclear Iran, the threat of nuclear attack and ultimate nuclear war, any more than I will allow the sons and the daughters of Arkansans and all Americans to live under that threat. So I look forward to this debate. I look forward to stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Mr. President, I note that